What's up YouTube? Ryan Panny here. Hope you guys are doing reasonably well. It is time for another discography ranking, which is some of the most challenging, but I would say rewarding content that I do for this channel. Because unlike reviewing a single album or whatever, you get to just watch a band's entire career arc. It's almost like graphing an equation, where some bands, when you walk through their album sequentially, they're more of a parabola, or a negative parabola. Some bands are just linear, and then there's some bands, in some extreme cases like AC/DC, that are just X equals 0. And it's always so much more illuminating to listen to a band's music with this larger context in mind. I always come to insights that I would never come to if I was just listening to it as a one-off or as part of a playlist or just I'm in the mood for this one album. And I had this crazy realization doing this one for All That Remains. I stepped back and listened to all these albums in a row and I was like, wait a second. I only unequivocally like a bare majority of this band's music. Their catalog is quite a bumpy road, and I never quite realized the extent to which that was true. Obviously, for me growing up, the main draw of All That Remains was and always will be the late great Ollie Herbert, who, rest in peace to Ollie, was probably the single greatest influence on my lead guitar playing. I've covered a lot of their solos on this channel. What Ollie taught me more than anything was the importance and the sort of nobility of treating a guitar solo as a meticulous note-by-note composition. That's what guitar solos and lead sections deserve. In Ollie Herbert's solos, every single note and every articulation of every single note was just labored over, and it always shone through, and it was a big part. It had a big positive effect on the appeal of All That Remains just as a band. That trashy Kerry King, Kirk Hammett style of just kind of wailing and seeing what happens, it just never sounded the same to me after studying Ollie solos so closely. And I think that in particular, if you're wondering, that's probably where my pro All That Remains bias started pretty early on. But now, listening back to these albums, there's a lot to critique. There is a lot to critique, and I think that'll make this one of the more interesting discography rankings that I've done. So let's get into it, man. 9 albums, 900 opinions. Let's do it. So of course, number 9, I can't imagine there are too many people out there who dispute this. The Order of Things, which I am not exaggerating when I say this is one of the worst modern metal albums, period. Like, this makes Killswitch Engage's self-titled record sound like a fucking masterpiece by comparison. I prefer the Suicide Silence self-titled record over this, if that gives you any context. And there are a million reasons, but the number one reason is just that it is completely soulless. Like who would have thought that in a genre like modern heavy metal, which is already, the production is already so mechanical and robotic sounding, that the emotions, or lack thereof, in the performances here come through with less soul and less vigor than the actual computerized drum sampling and guitar sampling. That's truly remarkable. The most awkward and calculated part of this record is the fact that After a War You Cannot Win, which is the record before this, All That Remains just didn't know whether they wanted to be a heavy band or like a radio hard rock band. So what they ended up doing was these incredibly painful, forced combinations where Phil would like sing completely clean over a part where a scream would make sense, just because they're trying to figure out like their balance. And it just created these, like, this probably won't end well, the opening track, which don't need to explain the irony of the title there. You got Phil singing completely clean in that second verse over a dissonant flat 5 note. It sounds like garbage. So this complete identity crisis and lack of direction, sometimes it shows up when the two are kind of mushed together, like in that case where you have Phil singing completely clean over heavy shit. And then sometimes they're even more forced when they're divided, pun intended. The worst song in the All That Remains catalog being Divide. It's like a pop rock song. And then on the other end, you have equally forced heavy moments like No Knock. And then of course, you have to have the absolutely abominable radio power ballad attempt with For You, which is the power ballad being something that All That Remains were just determined to have and determined to keep failing at over and over and over and over again. Case in point, the very easy choice for me for number 8 is Madness, which I highly encourage you guys to go check out the in-depth review that I did a couple years ago. I still really like that review, despite it being a couple years old. Madness, despite the completely obnoxious, like Nickelback level power balladry, which that was my attempt at a segue there, Madness I actually have a lot more respect for than Order of Things, because at least Madness was just so transparent and unapologetic about what the bands were trying to do in terms of commercial appeal. Like, at least they picked a side. On Order of Things, they just sounded confused and lost kind of in the woods. Producer Howard Benson was like, you know what? You guys want to ruin your band? Let's do it. I'll give you 2, I'll give you 3, I'll give you 8 radio ballads. Let's do it. I'm all in. I will water down these guitars to sound like Skillet it'll be great. And you know what? To be fair, I bet the band picked up a few like Middle America Octane listeners who never would have otherwise bothered with All That Remains until they saw Madness on the Walmart shelves. Number 7, we're taking it back to the band's debut, Behind Silence and Solitude, recorded almost 20 years ago now. You might be surprised if you're watching this to see this so low, given that it's more in the musical style that my viewers would expect me to like, but context is everything. And this metalcore attempt would go on to be done so much better, not just by All That Remains, but by all their peers. And so context just renders this record kind of irrelevant. Time has a funny impact on music. Like, there are records where if it turns out that people fail to replicate something or fail to surpass it, a record just gains acclaim and legacy over time, and vice versa. If there's a record that is very quickly proven as the years go by that everybody does it 100 times better, it just becomes irrelevant. I will concede that if you take some of the tracks on here and you add the production value and Phil's vocal intonations from This Darkened Heart and applied it to these songs, it would do a lot for this album. Because the sound really is primitive and Phil is just such a faceless and generic vocalist on here. He really has no independent identity yet. But that being said, you still have stuff on here that's completely unsalvageable, like the heavy intro to the song Erase. It sounds like it was jammed in a teenager's parents' garage, which it probably was. And you know, Ollie's lead playing on here actually isn't that good either. You have a song like From These Wounds where he just kind of appears out of nowhere with that neoclassical harmony section, and it makes no sense in context. And you also got to address the blatant at the gates jacking of songs like the title track and others. This is just a really immature and unrefined version of something that would just be done a million more times and a lot better. Okay, this one is interesting. A War You Cannot Win. This is a record that I fucking hated when it first came out, but this one actually benefits from context in reverse, meaning that what came after, directly after, was so abhorrent that you kind of look back and see this record in a totally different light. It does sound like shit. I mean, it's got the worst kick drum this side of 2010, 100%. And Rob Graves, who was involved with For We Are Many as a producer, him co-writing some of these songs, including the big power ballad, What If I Was Nothing, that's probably partially responsible for those songs being as shitty as they are. Stand Up being so fucking corny, and Asking Too Much is a song that makes like Bullet for My Valentine sound heavy. But you look at the rest of the track list and some of the edge still is there. You Can't Feel My Shadow, great song. Call to Non-Believers, Just Moments in Time is passable. And lyrically, these songs still have some bite and some grit to them in stark contrast to the lyrics on Order of Things. So ultimately what this record is, it's a transitional record. The band on this record have one foot in the past and one foot in, unfortunately, what would become their future, this increasingly melodic route. And the fact they chose their latter would be a detriment to their career, but this record by itself, you can't 100% lump into that category. Number 5, this will be probably my toughest pick to justify. This Darkened Heart. Great record, really like this record to this day, and of the top 5 here, it's the most purely entrenched in the so-called New England metalcore movement, and it's actually one of the records that to me really embodies that movement in the mid-2000s. But that's actually what gives it slightly less replay value. This Darkened Heart just reeks of 2004. And that's not inherently a bad thing. 2004 was not a bad year, but going back to it, it feels like sort of a confining listen. It's a listen of a very one-track mind. And that's just not what metal and All That Remains themselves ended up becoming. It turns out that the metalcore genre had a lot more to say than just this. The way that All That Remains would expand their sound on future records by getting simultaneously a tad more extreme on the one hand, and then on the other hand allowing the hard rock and 80s metal influences to seep in. See, that sort of expansion of your sound, it actually is often a weakness for bands to do that, and bands should kind of stick to what they're good at instead of trying to dilute it with all these unwelcome influences. But I'm going to argue here that in the case of this band in particular, it really strengthened their music. I still love this record though, I really do. And Death in My Arms is amazing. The title track is amazing. Tattered on My Sleeve, it's just, when you listen to the entire thing, it's slightly monolithic compared to what would come later. Next one has to be Overcome. Don't worry, I'm not about to go completely crazy on you. I'm sure there's a lot of people watching who would have expected Overcome to be number 5. Look, it came right after Fall of Ideals. It was never gonna stack up, but go back now and listen with fresh ears. This record is so damn underrated. And sequencing wise, it's fascinating because all the big singles are right up front, right in a row. But the second half of the record is equally strong. People completely overlook tracks like A Song for the Hopeless, which has like completely multiple personalities, being like alternating between being a full-on acoustic ballad and then those crushing double bass groups. That's a very compelling track. You keep going through the second half. Relinquish is one of the most intense songs on the record, one of my personal favorites, and also the title track is another reminder that this record is a lot heavier overall than people tend to give it credit for. And also Phil Labonte's experimentation with that kind of pancake layering of his singing and screaming is a studio experiment gone well. This record really only has two major missteps, which are the two ballads. You have Forever in Your Hands, which is a terribly sappy love song that somehow still tries to sound like a metal song and fails. And then you have the Nevermore cover, which Believe in Nothing is a song they should have stayed far away from. Go listen to the fucking original. It's just, come on guys. I'm gonna go ahead and argue that on Madness, when All That Remains attempted a country cover, they had better odds of making that work than trying to step in the shoes of Nevermore. For We Are Many at number 3, the follow-up to Overcome, I was so into this record when it came out. The band on this one, as opposed to how scattered their sound would become on the next couple of records, they really hone in on a specific formula here. And as a result, they feel so focused and so sure of themselves. It's not a record that's gonna dazzle with its innovation, but it is gonna impress you with its execution. You have songs like Last Time and Won't Go Quietly, as well as Faithless, which are basically all written the exact same way, but somehow stand alone. You have great deep cuts, like From the Outside, and you have the Waiting one, which is an actual tasteful ballad. There are a couple questionable choices on here, like the Some of the People breakdown is pretty cringy. I'm not a big fan of the talkbox solo in the song Won't Go Quietly, but in general, this is such a tight, self-assured, and well-executed version of the All That Remains formula. So much so that maybe it's not that surprising that they decided to shake things up with the next two records. All right, number 2. Did a whole video on how fucking underrated this album is, last year's Victim of the New Disease. Go watch the video I did, but basically, Ollie Herbert's swan song with the band is one of the greatest examples of a creative rebirth I can think of from a metal band. The fact that they went from fucking Madness to this in a year and a half is astounding. Lyrically, it's the band's best by miles, with Phil Labonte's nasty divorce being channeled into what is really a powerful breakup album for anybody out there who needs it. It's also by far the band's best sonically. I love all the tones on here, every piece of the drum kit. The rhythm guitar tone is a lot meaner and grittier, and just the band in general are a lot meaner on this album. Not more extreme, there's a difference, but meaner. Fuck Love and Blood I Spill and the title track are just meaner. And of course, what a beautiful irony that All That Remains finally decided to go heavy again. And now on their heavy record, they finally pull off not one, but two wonderful ballads, like real ballads. Alone in the Darkness and Just Tell Me Something with Danny Warsnott from Asking Alexandria of all people. These are tuneful and tasteful executions of the power ballad formula. So I imagine this pick in particular will be the subject of a lot of disagreement, so let me be very clear here. I 500% stand by this. Go back and listen to it, especially in comparison to these other records that you might have more nostalgia for. I promise you, you will eventually be brought over to my side. Number 1, however, I imagine will not be the subject of much debate, The Fall of Ideals. Believe it or not, for a while I actually entertained this not being number 1, but you sit down, you listen to it start to finish, and what I said about This Darkened Heart and Behind Silence and Solitude before that really rings true with The Fall of Ideals. The band expanding their sound, it was an absolute game changer. They welcomed in a blatant hard rock influence. You got The Air That I Breathe, you got like the Not Alone chorus, but there's also tracks like Empty Inside with those blast beats and Weak Willed, and also the criminally underrated Indictment, where the band actually got more extreme. So on The Fall of Ideals, what happened is the band sound just got more elastic at both ends, and they benefited both commercially and artistically. Other bands of their ilk just simply didn't go to the poles as much stylistically in terms of hard rock on one end and blast beats on the other. But Fall of Ideals sets an impeccable example for balance between heavy and melodic. Like, you sit and break this record down, it's exactly 50-50, right down the middle, and that's a remarkable accomplishment in and of itself. And All That Remains pull that balance off, that delicate balance off, with flying colors, and are so deserving of the career boost they got from it. So there you have it. All That Remains, ranked, sealed, delivered. You know, it was pretty difficult to condense this. I could do an extended video on each of these records. I had to cut a lot out, but it was fun. And here is what comes next. So I don't quite remember how probability math works. It's been a while, but I do know that there is a high probability that your list is different than my list. I'm pretty sure everybody watching inevitably disagrees. So what you do next is in the comment section, you leave your list along with, if you like, a description. That's honestly the most fun part of doing these discography rankings, especially when they get a bunch of responses. Just seeing the diversity of the lists. It's incredible how different everybody views the same set of music. So be sure to leave your list in the comment section along with any derogatory remarks you'd like to aim at me. And as always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video and are not yet subscribed to my channel, please consider doing so by clicking right over here, as well as checking out any of the other rock or metal related content that I publish here on a weekly basis. Really appreciate you watching, liking, disliking, just engaging in any fashion. Twitter, Instagram handle @RyanPannyMusic. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys soon.